It's time to turn to the legacies of the 1960s. I suspect that one of the reasons why many of you are here today is because of the impact that the 1960s has had and continues to have on American politics, American society, and American culture. The great novelist William Faulkner once wrote, "The past is never dead, it's not even past," and that is certainly true of the 1960s. It is also true that the legacies of the 1960s remain complicated and controversial. In the end, I suspect that what matters most is who you are and how you look at it, whether you determine the legacies are primarily positive or primarily negative. I want to look at the political, social, racial, international, and constitutional legacies of the 1960s and present some information, present a bit of perspective as well, and then we can discuss how you see the legacies of the 1960s and whether you see them as primarily positive or negative. I want to start with the political legacies of the 1960s. And of course, we live in a political world largely shaped, in my opinion, by the developments of the 1960s. When we look at the political legacies of the 1960s, we need to look at the legacies in terms of the electoral legacies and the ideological legacies of the 1960s, political legacies. The first point, which is rather basic, is that the conservative movement comes out of the 1960s as the most powerful political movement in this country, and it becomes dominant first within the Republican Party and then within American politics in general. Watergate was, in retrospect, a brief setback for the conservative movement. I would argue that in the long term, Watergate actually does more damage to liberals than conservatives, because Watergate, along with Vietnam, damages the faith that Americans have in their leaders, in their institutions, in their government. And ultimately, liberalism is an ideology of government. If you do not have faith in government, well, then you're probably going to become a conservative. From 1968 to the present, the Republicans win 7 out of 10 presidential elections. The Republicans lose in 1976 by quite a small margin, and that's remarkable given the fact that it's only 2 years after Watergate. Bill Clinton wins in 1992, largely thanks to the presence of independent Ross Perot on the ballot, then wins re-election in 1996. In the 7 presidential elections since 1980, the Republicans have lost a total of 5 southern states. As we've already mentioned before in class, the solid South is now reliably Republican, has been in American national elections now for 2 decades. In 1980, the Republicans captured the Senate for the first time since 1952. In 1994, the Republicans took control of Congress, House and Senate. Michael mentioned this individual, the new Speaker of the House, Republican Newt Gingrich from Georgia. He had a PhD in history. This is what he said about the 1960s, which I think is interesting. Gingrich said, quote, "There are profound things that went wrong in this country, starting with the Great Society and the counterculture. We simply need to erase the slate and start over." Gingrich is expressing, I think, quite clearly the conservative viewpoint that things went dramatically wrong beginning in the 1960s, and that one of the main missions of the conservative movement is to turn the clock back and, as he says, erase many of the changes that the 1960s have wrought. Now, as I mentioned, in electoral terms, the picture seems pretty clear. Not absolutely clear, but pretty clear that conservatives are dominating. But when we look at ideology, when we look at people's beliefs, then the picture becomes a little bit more mixed. One way to look at this is to argue that most Americans either were always or since the 1960s had become conservatives. In other words, one way to look at the beliefs of Americans is to argue that there has largely been a conservative consensus on a few key issues. Let me give you an example. Taxes are too high. They should be lowered. Government is too large. It needs to be shrunk. Social programs tend to cause rather than solve social problems. And it is also true that since 1980 in this country, most Democrats avoid the word liberal, the L word. They sort of call themselves progressive. They go to great lengths to avoid being labeled as liberals. Bill Clinton, the most successful Democrat in electoral terms since Franklin Roosevelt, he wins a second term, was most popular in this country, did best in the public opinion polls when he balanced budgets, proclaimed, quote, the end of welfare as we know it, and declared that the era of big government is over. Some scholars point to statements like this, facts like this, and argue that there is a conservative consensus when it comes to how Americans think about and view politics. But by many other measures, the American people remain at least as liberal as they were in the 1960s. Support for civil rights has grown. Support for gay rights has grown. Support for women's rights has grown. Now, I will say the polling data on these issues often depends on how the questions are framed and what words are used. So there's a lot of interesting data out there. But in general, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that the American people, by and large, haven't become more conservative, in fact, have become more liberal, more tolerant. And, I should also mention, support for middle-class entitlement programs, social programs like Social Security. Oh, I guess I don't have a picture of Medicare, but Medicare also has a great deal of support in our society as well, especially among older Americans. Support for these government programs has remained strong. One observation that Michael has made, and I certainly agree with, is that Americans often object to government in theory or principle, but not in practice, especially when government benefits them, their own self-interest. As long as government programs aren't seen to benefit the undeserving, they tend to have a great deal of popular support. And one thing that is clear is that by 2004, conservatives had not taken complete control of American politics. There was no mass or permanent realignment of political preferences by 2004. And in fact, we may be seeing a significant shift away from conservative principles, a shift that began in 2006 and may continue in 2008. It's hard to say. Going back to Bill Clinton for a moment, Bill Clinton, I think, put it in an interesting perspective when he observed that how you view the 1960s remains a real dividing line in American politics and really does reflect your particular partisan outlook. Bill Clinton said, quote, "If you look back on the 1960s and think there was more good than harm, you're probably a Democrat. If you think there was more harm than good in the 1960s, you're probably a Republican." And to some degree, that generalization does hold when we look at the political legacies of the 1960s. Now, what about the social legacies of the 1960s? Well, let me begin by talking about women, the women's movement and the feminist movement. And Michael talked about this a great deal this morning, so again, I won't go into a lot of detail here. As he mentioned, in the 1970s, there is a conservative backlash. It's led by women like Phyllis Schlafly, and it is focused on issues like the Equal Rights Amendment. You can see she is battling to stop the Equal Rights Amendment. Here you can see the actual progress or lack thereof of the Equal Rights Amendment. And of course, you can see quite clearly that ultimately the Equal Rights Amendment does not pass, largely because of conservative mobilization in southern states and border states, and a few western states as well. People sometimes ask how critical was Phyllis Schlafly's opposition to the Equal Rights Amendment. Scholars are divided on this point. She's clearly critical in organizing and mobilizing women to oppose the Equal Rights Amendment. That's clear. But some scholars argue her real significance is that she provides political cover for men who want to oppose the Equal Rights Amendment, but need to be able to point to women and groups of women and say it's not just men who oppose the Equal Rights Amendment, women are divided, and therefore it's legitimate for men to oppose the Equal Rights Amendment as well. Should also mention that the abortion issue is absolutely critical in mobilizing this backlash against the women's movement, the feminist movement. By the 1990s, we were in a world where relatively few men would openly acknowledge that they were feminists. I ask my students all the time, how many of you consider yourselves feminists? And frequently I get no hands or maybe one hand raised in the class. This outcome is, I think, in part related to the battles over abortion and the Equal Rights Amendment. It's also, I think, in part a reflection of the success that conservatives have had in caricaturing the feminist movement and in changing the language with which we talk about feminism. And here I'll simply provide one example. Feminazi. The word feminazi. I suspect that all of you have heard this term, coined by Rush Limbaugh, the conservative commentator on the radio. My students certainly all know that expression. You begin to talk about feminism and immediately the word feminazi appears, and then you sort of ask students, well, what image comes to mind when we use the word feminazi? And immediately you sort of get the caricature of the sort of man-hating feminist, often a lesbian as well, and you sort of get a caricature even of radical feminism. And yet here too the picture is really mixed. Relatively few people will openly admit that they are feminists. The word has become demonized or caricatured in our culture. And yet, conservatives have not been able to turn back the clock on this critical issue, and it doesn't appear likely that they will be able to. I do this in my class, and I suspect many of you do as well. You ask young women, do they expect to have the same educational opportunities as the young men in the room? Yes, they all expect to have the same educational opportunities. And in fact, as we all know, a majority of the individuals earning college degrees in this country now are women. Women have almost achieved parity in terms of medical degrees, law degrees, graduate school, PhD. They're moving towards parity in PhDs as well. Most young women, especially middle-class, college-educated young women, expect to have the same career opportunities as men and to earn the same wages for comparable work. Most young women expect to share the responsibility of childcare and housework with their partner. Although, as we all know, the second shift remains a reality, and it's interesting to note surveys show many men believe that they are in fact now sharing equally the duties of child rearing and housework, and interestingly enough, their wives and partners have a very different view of their contributions. But it's interesting, of course, that men today, most men today, accept the idea that they are expected to contribute, if not share equally, to these household duties. And of course, one of the reasons why I think the clock hasn't is that, well, frankly, the fact that conservatives can't turn back the clock on the women's movement is partly a reflection of feminist ideals. It's also, I think, largely a reflection of economic necessity. In the world in which we live today, most families, especially middle-class families, need two incomes. There's simply economic reality at work here, and going back to a world in which one parent, especially a woman, stays home full-time beyond the period when children are small, well, that would put a significant crimp on the economic expectations of families and individuals. I should also point out that obviously many women have become leaders in societies, have achieved positions of prominence. Madeleine Albright was the first female Secretary of State, of course, with Condoleezza Rice being the second as well. We also have women who have become corporate leaders, like Martha Stewart. The fact that Martha Stewart eventually had to spend a little time in prison is interesting, since unlike many of the other male corporate figures involved in some of the scandals of recent years, she actually served her time and actually went to prison for a while. Of course, I don't want to minimize this fact. In the corporate world, the glass ceiling does remain a reality, and that was discussed this morning as well. And yet, women are starting to make progress in corporate America, undoubtedly not as quickly as they should, but there is progress being made. And of course, we had a woman on the Supreme Court. We have two now, well, one, Sandra Day O'Connor. The interesting thing about Sandra Day O'Connor is, to go back to the 1960s, she graduates near the top of her class. In fact, I think she was second in her class at Stanford Law School. She goes back to her hometown of Phoenix. No private law firm in Phoenix will hire her. She has to hang out a shingle, go into private practice on her own. Eventually, she moves into the public sector, becomes a judge, and then, of course, is eventually nominated to the Supreme Court. But it's a reflection on how the world in which we lived has changed in a relatively short period of time, 40 years or so, a blink of time in historical terms. Sandra Day O'Connor comes out of law school, Stanford Law School, and can't get a position, and eventually reaches the Supreme Court as well. One thing, too, to mention, some concepts that didn't exist in the 1960s. Michael mentioned this morning sexual harassment. The idea of sexual harassment, the concept of sexual harassment didn't exist in the 1960s. The idea that there were inappropriate behaviors in the workplace that should not be permitted. Men should not be permitted to harass women. Of course, now that exists in the law. Marital rape, spousal rape. This is a remarkable thing. In the 1960s, a man who was married had a right to expect, essentially, sex on demand. Wives did not have a legal right to resist. A man could even, in many cases, use physical force and impose himself upon his wife if he wanted to have sexual relations. Thanks to the women's movement, the feminist movement, of course, marital rape becomes part of our legal statute. And of course, we now have domestic violence, and things sort of spring from there. But again, a significant change in attitudes and behaviors. Also, by the way, date rape, of course, an evolving concept which didn't exist in the 1960s as well. These are concepts that have both legal standing in our society now and social stigma, which reflects a dramatic change from the 1960s. Dramatic change from the 1960s. We talked about the gay and lesbian movement this morning. As Michael mentioned, in the 1960s, millions of gay and lesbian Americans were for the first time open about their sexuality. They came out of the closet. By the 1990s, the debate had shifted, largely shifted, from general acceptance to gay marriage, which a majority of Americans over the age of 30 opposed. In 2004, the election, in my opinion, cost the Democratic candidate, Senator John Kerry, the state of Ohio, and by extension cost him the election. This is a matter of some debate among political scientists, but in Ohio, I believe, in 2004, it was the issue that doomed Kerry in Ohio. Polls also showed, however, that a majority of Americans supported civil unions and partner benefits. And what I also think is interesting is that polls show a majority of Americans under the age of 30 support gay marriage today, which suggests that in a generation or so, gay marriage may become as accepted as interracial marriage. Interracial marriage is an interesting subject to look at. In 1967, the Supreme Court struck down state bans on interracial marriage in the Loving case. At the time the Supreme Court acted, polls showed that 75% of Americans opposed interracial marriage, thought the Supreme Court was making a mistake. Today, polls shows that opposition to interracial marriage is in the single digits, It's on the verge of disappearing in society. Also, a little side note to history, the Supreme Court decision striking down interracial marriage appears on the very day that a film called Guess Who's Coming to Dinner appears in movie theaters. This is a remarkable historical coincidence, which I learned about in a terrific book that just came out this year called Pictures at a Revolution by Mark Harris, which is about the 5 films nominated for Best Picture in 1968. So you can actually read about the history behind Guess Who's Coming to Dinner if that's a film that you like or know. What we see in society today, I would argue, is that the values of the counterculture, or many of the values of the counterculture, values like tolerance, freedom, individuality, have become mainstream. Self-expression has trumped self-denial in personal and sexual matters. And yet this development is hotly contested in our society today. Liberals celebrate this trend. Liberals tend to see the triumph of these values, tolerance, freedom, etc., as desirable, perhaps inevitable, and perhaps even irreversible. Conservatives see this as a very troubling trend. This spread of values, the spread of tolerance, freedom, individuality, it threatens families, and that's important because families are the cornerstone of society, and it threatens children, who are the future of society. Here it's interesting for a moment to pause because I think there's a certain amount of misunderstanding here as to why many conservatives are so opposed to gay marriage. It's not because most conservatives see gay marriage as a direct threat to themselves or to their families, but they see it as an indirect threat. Conservatives see homosexuality as a choice. Conservatives fear that if gay marriage is accepted and legalized, children, their children, will see this as a socially acceptable choice to make in society. The normalizing of gay relationships, the sanctification of gay relationships through marriage is threatening because it will give children a sense that this is an acceptable choice to make in society. And that's where a great deal of the conservative opposition comes from. That's why the culture wars are so heated, and as Michael points out, it's very hard to end culture wars. They're amorphous, and unless one side completely defeats the other, they're likely to continue for a long period of time. Just showing you some charts of public opinion here. And unfortunately, these don't go all the way back into the 1960s. They mostly go back into the early 1970s. One thing you can see is a relatively significant increase in the percentage of those who believe that homosexuals should be allowed to teach in colleges and universities. Growing tolerance. And one point to remember, this growing tolerance is taking place against a backdrop of conservative political success. I just want to go back to that point again about the conservatives enjoying political success even as the ideas, these social ideas that they're battling against, are also getting greater acceptance in society. The percentage who think the use of marijuana should be made legal. And you can see despite conservative political successes of recent years, we are near a peak in terms of the number of those Americans who believe that marijuana should be legalized, whether it's for recreational or for medicinal uses. And obviously this is one of the complicating factors here. What percentage believe marijuana should be legalized only for medicinal purposes? Premarital sex as well, you can see a drop in the percentage of those who think that sex before marriage is always wrong. And of course, the drop would be more dramatic if this particular graph went back to the years before 1972, if it went back to 1968. What about the racial legacies of the 1960s? Well, I put this photograph, this rather provocative photograph, up for a reason. Most of us remember the Simpson trial, the O.J. Simpson trial, you know. If the glove doesn't fit, you must acquit, which was Johnny Cochran's description of this particular incident. I put this up because, once again, the picture here is very mixed, and it very much depends on your personal racial perspective. Many white Americans believe that the racial situation in this country is improving, is getting better, and there is evidence to suggest it is. Many black Americans strongly disagree and do not see the sort of racial progress that they would like or expect in society. There are moments when the chasm of perception between whites and blacks is revealed or uncovered. This was one particular moment. After the O.J. case, after the verdict was released, white Americans were shocked and appalled by the verdict. Black Americans generally supported the verdict, although if you really dig beneath the surface, there was a significant number of black Americans who thought that O.J. was guilty, but also thought that it was time that a message was sent to the criminal justice system in general about the selective prosecution of African Americans and the targeting of African Americans in society. Let me continue with this idea about a mixed picture here. One way to look at the racial situation in this country today and the legacy of the 1960s is to look at urban America and to see that schools have deteriorated, crime has risen, families have disintegrated, and good jobs have disappeared. In other words, echoing the language of the Kerner Commission, blacks and whites continue to live in two worlds, separate and unequal, and perhaps becoming even more so. The racial isolation in this country growing as well, segregation growing as well, as whites and blacks live in very different worlds. This situation, this view of the racial legacies of the 1960s, leads liberals to argue that affirmative action remains as vital, as necessary as ever. And of course, it is Lyndon Johnson who in 1965, in a very important speech, really signals a commitment by the federal government to the principle of affirmative action. In this famous speech, he says, "You do not wipe away the scars of centuries by saying, 'Now you are free to go where you want, do as you desire.' You do not take a person who for centuries has been hobbled by chains and liberate him, bring him up to the starting line of a race and say, 'You are free to compete with all the others,' and still believe that you have been completely fair." And of course, he goes on to say, "We do not seek just freedom, but opportunity, not just equality as a right and theory, but equality as a fact and as result." Liberals have, in general, supported affirmative action ever since. Bill Clinton's position on affirmative action is interesting. He was opposed to conservative efforts to end affirmative action. His phrase was, "Mend it, don't end it. Let's fix it, let's make it better, but let's not remove affirmative action." Conservatives contend that affirmative action has led to reverse discrimination and that it violates Dr. King's dream of a colorblind nation. This is part of the process in which conservatives have appropriated elements of Dr. King's message to support conservative policy goals. In Congress and in the courts, conservatives have mounted an aggressive campaign against racial preferences, against affirmative action, whose future is uncertain at best. I won't go through the history of these cases. I think, as many of you may recall, in 1978, in the Bakke case, the Supreme Court said you could not have formal quotas for minority applicants, in that particular case, applicants to medical school, but you could have informal goals and preferences for applicants. The Bakke case did not end the confusion, the controversy. It continued to grow. It grew because, on the one hand, there was a compelling state interest in diversity, in broadening participation in colleges and universities and graduate schools, in the workplace. But there was controversy. Many whites saw this as reverse discrimination. 25 years later, in a pair of cases, the Supreme Court revisits affirmative action. These involve the University of Michigan, the Gratz case and the Grutter case. I won't go into the details of this. In Gratz, the Supreme Court ruled that the University of Michigan could not automatically award extra points to minority applicants who wanted to attend Michigan as undergraduates. In other words, you could not have a fixed, inflexible process that automatically gave every minority applicant a certain boost in the process. On the other hand, the Supreme Court also ruled by a 5-4 margin in Grutter that Michigan Law School could continue to take race into consideration as part of a flexible and individualized admissions process. It's interesting to note in the Grutter case, not only did universities argue that diversity was a compelling state interest, but so too did major corporations. The U.S. military also argued that it was critical that it be allowed to show some selective preferences because it needed, for example, to have more minorities in the officer corps so that the military could function effectively. 5 justices on the Supreme Court bought that argument. Sandra Day O'Connor, who I mentioned before, wrote the majority opinion in the Grutter decision. She also wrote, and I quote, "We expect that 25 years from now, the use of racial preferences will no longer be necessary to further the interest approved today." In a sense, what Sandra Day O'Connor has put an expiration date on affirmative action. Now, whether future courts are going to accept her expiration date is unclear, but that's what she wrote in her opinion, her 5-4 opinion. Whether the civil rights legislation of the 1960s and affirmative action, whether it's been successful or not, is controversial. But it does seem clear that the doors of educational and political opportunity have opened for at least some individuals. The number of black college graduates and elected officials has risen steadily in our society. In suburban America, a black middle class has emerged that has produced professionals at every level of private and public employment. Colin Powell, of course, being one example. Racial tolerance in this country has, in a relatively short time, increased markedly. Now, this is, of course, subject to debate. On the one hand, racist remarks are no longer considered socially acceptable. Does that mean that racist remarks are no longer made? No. Certainly not. But the fact that they're no longer, in general, socially acceptable does suggest some progress. I mentioned interracial marriage, which is now widely accepted. And then there's this individual, Tiger Woods. Tiger Woods is the most recognizable individual on the planet. On the planet. What is interesting about Tiger Woods is that he refuses to classify or define himself as African American. Because of his mother's Filipino heritage, he argues, what about my Asian American heritage as well? Tiger Woods argues that he is multiracial. That's how he chooses to see himself. And where this is significant, more and more Americans, especially young people, are defining themselves as multiracial rather than either black or white. What this suggests is that in the future, racial distinctions may diminish. They may even disappear at some point in the future. And I'll be happy to take questions as soon as I finish, but I think we just have to work with the taping process here. Let me talk briefly about the international legacies of the 1960s. This is obviously a photograph from Vietnam, and this is really the issue that I want to focus on here. Vietnam marks the end of the bipartisan Cold War containment consensus between Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives. This analogy dominated historical thinking when America went into Vietnam. The notion that we had to confront aggression wherever and whenever it appeared. If you don't stand up to dictators, be they fascist or communist, well, democracy is threatened. The Munich analogy, going back to 1938 and the Munich conference in Europe on the eve of World War II. By 1975 and by the end of the Vietnam War, we now have the Vietnam Syndrome, what I like to call the Vietnam Syndrome. Other scholars have called it different, given it different names. This replaces the Munich analogy and becomes the new paradigm for a new generation of Americans. The greatest generation, the World War II generation, is beginning to pass from the scene. The baby boomers are beginning to move into positions of political power. How individuals view the Vietnam syndrome is very much a reflection of their personal political perspective. Let me begin with the liberal perspective. Liberals see Vietnam as a tragic mistake. It's a war we should not have entered, we should not have fought. But Vietnam, from the liberal perspective, was also a healthy corrective to American arrogance and hubris. America had at last learned a very important lesson, which is that we cannot and should not stick our nose into everyone else's business. We should not assume that we can dominate world affairs and dictate the affairs of other countries whenever we see fit. Liberals applaud the passage of the War Powers Act, which limits, at least in theory, the ability of a president to place American troops in harm's way without a formal declaration of war by Congress. Conservatives dramatically disagree with this perspective. As I mentioned the other day, conservatives like Ronald Reagan saw Vietnam as a noble cause. We were right to be in Vietnam. We were right to be in Vietnam. We were right to be there to defend democracy, to stop communist aggression, to defend American national security. Conservatives see Vietnam as an unhealthy cancer for American pride and power. Since Vietnam, America was too reluctant to project its power, to fight for what it thought was right around the world. Conservatives look at the War Powers Act and argue that it was a mistake. It was a dangerous curb on executive authority, on presidential power. What America must do is not avoid another Vietnam. What we must do is avoid another retreat like Vietnam. That's what's really threatening to this country's national security, not becoming involved in an unnecessary war, not getting bogged down in a quagmire. That's not the threat. From the conservative position, the real threat is cutting and running, leaving too soon, not maintaining our commitments, not standing up with our friends, not opposing our foes vigorously enough. That's how conservatives see the lesson of Vietnam. Conservatives fear a loss of national credibility in terms of American power, unlike liberals who fear a loss of national credibility in terms of American principle. Liberals argue that what the Vietnam War did was significantly damage our standing in the world because this country seemed to have abandoned its principle of freedom, democracy, values like that. From a conservative standpoint, what was lost in Vietnam was American credibility, respect for American power, respect for the American military. Now, for a time, I would argue, the liberal interpretation of the Vietnam syndrome held sway. There was a reluctance to become involved in foreign wars, foreign conflicts. Now, this is also a matter of some debate, but you take a look at the 1980s. President Reagan. Reagan never gives serious thought to putting U.S. troops into El Salvador and Nicaragua. Even as the U.S. is pursuing policies in those countries, we're supporting the Contras, for example, in Nicaragua. We're supporting the government of El Salvador in various ways, but never gives serious thought to putting U.S. troops in these countries, even though, according to the Reagan administration, these were critical battlegrounds against communism in the 1980s. But the influence of this liberal interpretation, even at the peak of his popularity, Reagan is not willing to put American troops in harm's way in the 1980s. Not directly, not in Latin America. What changes the world, of course, changes the American world perspective, of course, is 9/11. 9/11 is shocking and significant in many, many ways. But one thing it does is suddenly shatter the illusion that we are insulated from the threats of the world here at home, that the violence and the disorder of the world can't touch us here. And of course, it reopens this debate. It reignites this debate over what is the best way to protect this country? What is the best way to provide national security? Maybe we need to become more proactive, preemptive, go after the enemy, go after the terrorists before they can perpetrate other forms of terrorism here on American soil. And as a result, in 2003, the Bush administration makes the decision to go directly after Saddam Hussein in Iraq. The decision to go into Iraq rekindles memories of the Vietnam War. Liberals immediately begin to make an analogy with Vietnam. Liberals note that both of these conflicts, the conflict in Vietnam and the conflict in Iraq, began after murky allegations by the White House, whether we're talking about the Gulf of Tonkin incident or the weapons of mass destruction that Saddam Hussein was alleged to have. Both wars, according to liberals, began with great ambitions and unrealistic expectations: to stop the spread of communism or terrorism and bring democracy to oppressed peoples who would welcome U.S. intervention. Both wars, again according to liberals, began with no real understanding of the costs or consequences involved in fighting a civil and guerrilla war in a part of the world where the U.S. had little historical or cultural experience. And finally, liberals note, both wars began with no exit strategy, no clear exit strategy. How would we define and declare victory? How would we leave? How would we know when the governments of South Vietnam or Iraq were strong enough and stable enough to stand on their own? As I say, liberals quickly embrace the analogy between Vietnam and Iraq. Conservatives reject it. Conservatives point out the differences. The only time conservatives have accepted this analogy with Vietnam is when they've argued we can't cut and run, because they point to what happens in Southeast Asia after the U.S. leaves, and they point out the death and destruction that spreads across the region after we leave, and they say the same thing will happen in the Middle East if we leave Iraq prematurely, and oh, by the way, that could threaten the oil resources of the Middle East, which could also have a devastating impact on the United States. This leads rather naturally to one of the significant, I think, constitutional legacies of the 1960s, which is a debate over the proper balance of power between the executive branch, the judicial branch, and the legislative branch. This is a photograph, obviously, of the Watergate office complex in Washington, D.C. So I'm talking here about Watergate and the impact on mistrust of government. And we already discussed this earlier, that Vietnam and Watergate profoundly erode public confidence, trust in the government and in our leaders. Watergate also has an interesting impact on the media. At first, Watergate appears to be a great victory for the media. The media is now the fourth estate, co-equal with our other branches of government. Investigative journalists like Bernstein and Woodward become celebrities. Movies are made of them. They are portrayed by actors like Dustin Hoffman and Robert Redford. Enrollments in journalism schools skyrocket. Everyone wants to be an investigative journalist. And yet in some ways, it was kind of an empty or Pyrrhic victory for the media, because at the same time, growing doubts start to emerge about whether the media should have this kind of power in society. Do we want an unelected, unaccountable fourth estate? Conservatives especially are dubious because they see this media estate dominated by liberals. And in fact, some can argue that Watergate really backfires against the media and really contributes to a sense that the media is biased and has too much influence in our society. Taking it even one step further, you can make a case Watergate really reflects the last hurrah for print journalists, because the rise of TV journalism really gains force after Watergate. And of course, television journalists have a very difficult time telling the complicated story that is Watergate. And so many scandals, it's much more difficult to actually tell. Watergate leads to a process that I like to call scandal saturation in the United States. Every single time there is a crisis or controversy in American society now, in government, in Washington, we get calls for a special prosecutor, we get investigations, and we get a lot of partisan fighting back and forth. So you get the Iran-Contra scandal of the Reagan years, and then, of course, you get the Clinton impeachment in 1998. And just, you can see the power of the cameras, and there's Kenneth Starr right in the middle of it all. It's interesting to note, we talked about Watergate. Many, many conservatives saw the Clinton impeachment as political payback for Watergate. There was a historical resonance here, a sense that you got one of ours, now we're going to get one of yours. And so you get this cycle of crisis, this sort of political partisan payback mood in Washington. And more critically, you get a balance of power issue. Watergate weakens the executive branch, strengthens the congressional branch, and the pendulum swings as the Cold War begins to end. Liberals celebrate the shift away from the imperial presidency. Conservatives do not, in general, celebrate this constitutional shift in power away from the executive branch. In fact, what I think is interesting to note, many conservatives use the phrase imperiled presidency. Liberals like to use the phrase the imperial presidency to argue the president is too powerful. Conservatives like to use the phrase the imperiled presidency. The president is too weak. The executive branch needs more power. And of course, one key conservative here is this man, Vice President Cheney, who served in the Nixon administration and felt from that time forward that Watergate had led to unfair and unconstitutional restrictions on the power of the president. Cheney, to some degree, made it his mission to reverse this process, to strengthen the power of the executive, and Cheney believes in a theory known as the unitary executive, in which the executive branch is superior to the other branches. They may not oversee or limit how the president carries out his duties, especially in wartime and especially in regard to national security. And President Bush has, of course, followed this path, has dramatically expanded the power of the presidency in the wake of 9/11, the USA Patriot Act, other legislation as well. What I think is perhaps most significant, beyond how it has conducted the war on terror, beyond the issue of treatment of detainees at Guantanamo, beyond the recording of private phone conversations, beyond the investigation of personal bank records, beyond all of the things that the USA Patriot Act has authorized, President Bush has also issued hundreds of signing statements. And this is a process that not that many people have paid attention to. Every single time President Bush signs into law a piece of legislation passed by Congress, he also has been issued, not every time, but hundreds of times, he has issued signing statements in which he gives his own personal interpretation of the legislation that he has just signed. In many cases, his signing statements reflect a fundamentally different interpretation from what Congress has intended. But what Bush is signaling is an intention either not to enforce the law as Congress has intended, or to prepare for a possible court challenge down the road to that legislation. I should mention, Bush has issued more signing statements relative to legislation passed by Congress than all previous presidents in American history combined. This is a very, very significant development, and it has real constitutional implications for the future. The point here, simply, the legacy of the 1960s, the legacy of Watergate, very much casting a shadow over the constitutional balance of powers in the world in which we live today. A shadow, though, I should emphasize once again, that is strongly contested and debated. I now want to conclude and leave us time to discuss all of these issues that I've just raised. And so I want to be brief, and I also want to give credit where credit's due. This overview of views on the 1960s was plagiarized from Michael's book, so he should recognize this, this overview. But four general interpretations of the 1960s. A conservative view: the 1960s were dark days when America went down the wrong road. We abandoned traditional moral values, and we have had significant negative change in our society. America is a worse place as a result of the 1960s. The liberal view: the 1960s were glorious days, when America at long last, waged the good fight against racism and war and injustice, leading to significant positive change. The country is a better place as a result of the 1960s. Perhaps not as good as it should be, but a better place nonetheless. There's a moderate view, a negative view, which is that the 60s led to relatively little change, and that the 60s has left apathetic and disillusioned Americans prisoners of conformity and consumerism. But there's also a moderate positive view as well. The 60s led to some change in society. It injected into our life some healthy skepticism, and it led to some healthy doubt of authority, belief, and goals. Conservative columnist George Will has observed, so powerful are the energies let loose in the 60s that there cannot now be, and may never be, anything like a final summing up. After all, what is the final result of the Civil War? The Civil War of the 1860s he's talking about here now. It's too soon to say. And that may be, for the conflicts of the 60s continue to cast a large shadow over American politics and society today. Was the pain and turmoil of the long 1960s worth it? Was the struggle to create a beloved community, or build a great society, or end the Vietnam War, or create gender equality, were all of these struggles ultimately worth it? Ultimately, I'm going to argue, the answer lies beyond the realm of history. It depends on who you are and on what values you hold. Thank you. As well, and then we can discuss how you see the legacies of the 1960s and whether you see them as primarily positive or negative. I want to start with the political legacies of the 1960s. And of course, we live in a political world largely shaped, in my opinion, by the developments of the 1960s. When we look at the political legacies of the 1960s, we need to look at the legacies in terms of the electoral legacies and the ideological legacies of the 1960s, political legacies. The first point, which is rather basic, is that the conservative movement comes out of the 1960s as the most powerful political movement in this country, and it becomes dominant first within the Republican Party and then within American politics in general. Watergate was, in retrospect, a brief setback for the conservative movement. I would argue that in the long term, Watergate actually does more damage to liberals than conservatives. It's time to turn to the legacies of the 1960s. I suspect that one of the reasons why many of you are here today is because of the impact that the 1960s has had and continues to have on American politics, American society, and American culture. The great novelist William Faulkner once wrote, "The past is never dead, it's not even past," and that is certainly true of the 1960s. It is also true that the legacies of the 1960s remain complicated and controversial. In the end, I suspect that what matters most is who you are and how you look at it, whether you determine the legacies are primarily positive or primarily negative. I want to look at the political, social, racial, international, and constitutional legacies of the 1960s and present some information, present a bit of perspectives, because Watergate, along with Vietnam, damages the faith that Americans have in their leaders, in their institutions, in their government. And ultimately, liberalism is an ideology of government. If you do not have faith in government, well, then you're probably going to become a conservative. From 1968 to the present, the Republicans win 7 out of 10 presidential elections. The Republicans lose in 1976 by quite a small margin, and that's remarkable given the fact that it's only 2 years after Watergate. Bill Clinton wins in 1992, largely thanks to the presence of independent Ross Perot on the ballot, then wins re-election in 1996. In the 7 presidential elections since 1980, the Republicans have lost a total of 5 southern states. As we've already mentioned before in class, the solid South is now reliably Republican, has been in American national elections now for 2 decades. Not absolutely clear, but pretty clear that conservatives are dominating. But when we look at ideology, when we look at people's beliefs, then the picture becomes a little bit more mixed. One way to look at this is to argue that most Americans either were always or since the 1960s had become conservatives. In other words, one way to look at the beliefs of Americans is to argue that there has largely been a conservative consensus on a few key issues. Let me give you an example. Taxes are too high. They should be lowered. Government is too large. It needs to be shrunk. Social programs tend to cause rather than solve social problems. And it is also true that since 1980 in this country, most Democrats avoid the word liberal decades. In 1980, the Republicans captured the Senate for the first time since 1952. In 1994, the Republicans took control of Congress, House and Senate. Michael mentioned this individual, the new Speaker of the House, Republican Newt Gingrich from Georgia. He had a PhD in history. This is what he said about the 1960s, which I think is interesting. Gingrich said, quote, "There are profound things that went wrong in this country, starting with the Great Society and the counterculture. We simply need to erase the slate and start over." Gingrich is expressing, I think, quite clearly the conservative viewpoint that things went dramatically wrong beginning in the 1960s, and that one of the main missions of the conservative movement is to turn the clock back and, as he says, erase many of the changes that the 1960s have wrought. Now, as I mentioned, in electoral terms, the picture seems pretty clear.